You're listening to Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self, a podcast about wilderness Christian mysticism. I'm your host, Stephen Hatch, a contemplative living in New Mexico and former faculty at Naropa University. For over 45 years, I've been leading a simple lifestyle, combining family life with meditation, silence, and solitary time in the great outdoors. Along the way, I've developed an outlook rooted in Christian spirituality, informed by the world's great mystical traditions, and inspired by the wisdom found in nature. I'll be joined by my co-host, Will Warwick, also a contemplative, nature lover, and religious studies scholar. This podcast is for kindred mystics, lovers of nature, and people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. It's for those who are genuine seekers of truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's for those who want to live a more authentic life. Please join us as we explore the vast landscape of this contemplative tradition.
Welcome back, friends and listeners. It's a new month and fall is upon us. The colors are changing in most parts of the states. And I must say, Stephen, that I've really enjoyed seeing your photos of the aspen leaves turning golden yellow there in Colorado and New Mexico. So before we begin, I'm wondering if you don't mind sharing what it's been like for you, not just photographing the aspens, but being around them. What do they stir in your imagination? What emerges from that?
I love this time of year. I hike into one place in Colorado, Kebler Pass. I met a National Geographic photographer there once who told me it was the second largest aspen grove in the world. So you can hike for over an hour in aspens. And in the fall, it's amazing. It's just this golden glow. The very air is gold. And what I find is it ministers to my heart. I find myself doing prayer practices that are centered in my heart. And I have a visceral experience of the presence of Christ when I am hiking in an aspen grove. I feel this warmth and I feel this light. For me, that's this experience of Christ, the light of Jesus and the warmth of Mary Magdalene united together in this heart warmth that then is expressed outwardly in this golden glow. And then when I get back into my tent, I try to set up a tent in an area where there's aspens all around. I can smell that beautiful fall leaves smell that you get from within my tent. And I found it very invigorating and calming at the same time. I just love this time of year.
Yes, it's such a wonderful time of year. And it makes one thankful to be living in a place that has all four seasons. Thanks, Stephen, for sharing that with us. It's also a really nice segue into our topic for this episode, which is embracing paradox, the poetic imagination of a mystic.
Yes, close to my heart.
Now, for our listeners, on this episode, we're going to be diving into something a little mind-bending, but super fascinating. The idea that opposites aren't always, opposite. Have you ever heard of the phrase crazy wisdom? It's this mystical concept from Tibetan Buddhism that turns normal logic on its head. Imagine a world where things that seem totally separate, like light and darkness, emptiness and form, can suddenly become the same thing. In our everyday lives, we're used to thinking of opposites as completely different. But in the spiritual world, things work a little differently. It's not about making sense in a logical way, but about tapping into something deeper. And the best way to do that? Through the power of imagination. In fact, imagination is the only way to truly grasp these paradoxes and mysteries. So today, we're going to talk about how opposites can shapeshift into each other, how imagination helps us understand deeper spiritual truths, and how poets and mystics are able to harness the imagination. In addition, we're also going to explore the primary ways of relating with God, the divine, and how we can deepen our understanding and experience of God via our faculty of the imagination. Yet before we dive further into today's material, there is one other thing we would like to share with you. Recently, we received a message from one of our listeners. In fact, we received a note from a retired Catholic priest. And after listening to our first episode, he wrote to us. And here's what he said. Quote, "As I reflected on your words, I could relate to so much of your dialogue. I think it's the search that gives meaning to life. I struggle with a religion that has all the answers. That's what troubles me about our current Catholic structure and practice. Our male-dominated, dogmatic hierarchy is so cocky about truth. I'm outgrowing that model of religion. True religion is supposed to liberate, not a license to do anything and everything that pleases me, but a liberation that lifts me up to an awareness of a higher power rooted in love. A love that challenges as well as one that consoles. A love that places the accent on positive without denying the evil that undermines goodness. Life is a mystery to be lived, not a problem to be solved. True religion is not about control. It's a life force that motivates the believer to beauty and goodness." I thought those were wonderful things that he said, and it was very encouraging to receive those words, especially for myself, who, as we talked about in that first episode, I have roots in the Catholic tradition, and I could really relate to a lot of the things you were saying.
Yeah, and I think also in the context of this podcast, we're liberated to use our imaginations. So I can relate to what he said there.
Yeah, and even he referred to the paradoxical nature of the mystical life that we're going to be exploring today. That religion doesn't just comfort, it challenges. And there's creative tension at times between the two.
That's right.
So, Stephen, in your book, Expanse of God, Caressa Sophia, you say that it is nature that stimulates my imagination most profoundly.
Yes, that's true. There are so many images and so many creatures, and there's just so much happening there. It's a cauldron of imagination. So, yeah, it makes sense that that would apply to the spiritual life, since that's what the Creator indwells.
So, why is imagination so important for a mystic?
Well, if you think of it, the source of life is a creator, creative force, who uses imagination to create this world that just comes bubbling out of the creative source, whom we call God in the Christian tradition. So it makes sense that if we as human beings are made in the image of God, we are going to be creative and we are going to bring things forth through imagination. It's just a no brainer. If you look at this world, it's certainly not brought about by logic. Look at all of the various different kinds of creatures and look at the various paradoxes and opposites that we all struggle with. Obviously, it's divine imagination that is at the root of it all. In fact, some of the indigenous traditions play up on the humorous aspect of that. The creator is a raven or a crow or a coyote or a spider. So there's a playfulness at the root of all things, and that gives us the license to be playful as well with our theology. So it just makes total sense in my mind.
Yeah. And you speak of imagination as a faculty of perception as compared to logic, which has its limits.
That's right. Well, there are two different faculties of perception. One is a logical faculty, and another is an imaginative faculty. And I think in our culture, often we think that logic is the only way. And of course, it works well. in many of the domains in which we live our lives. But the spiritual, which is the ground on which everything appears, is the one where the imaginative comes into its own as actually a faculty of perception.
What would you say are some of the limits to logic?
The interesting thing is that logic, especially as Aristotle developed it, keeps opposites apart. I've often heard it said that Western philosophy starts with opposites apart and then tries to figure out how they fit together, whereas mystical logic starts with them together and then tries to figure out how they could ever be apart.
Hmm.
In Aristotelian logic, you start, with one thing. Say A. A is only A, and B is only B. Solid matter is only solid matter, and transparent sky is only transparent sky. And so, therefore, A can't be B and B can't be A. Solidity can't be transparent, and transparency can't be solid. Mystical logic says, well, wait a minute. Actually, opposites, they continually shapeshift into each other. We get a hint of this from quantum physics, where, we see that matter is actually 99% empty space. But in mystical logic, you say, yeah, A is only A and B is only B. But then, surprise, A is B and B is A. So you get this sense that you look at solid matter and suddenly, poof, it's totally transparent. Or you start with spacious awareness, spaciousness, and suddenly, poof, all the form appears. So opposites continually shapeshift into each other. In Christian theology, it's called the circle dance or the perichoresis, where they're constantly dancing and cycling into each other. In some forms of tantric Buddhism, it's called spherical logic. So you start out with one thing and it cycles around and becomes its opposite. It makes sense then that the imagination would be the prime faculty for being able to become aware of this kind of shapeshifting, whereas logic tries to keep things separate, at least Aristotelian logic does. So you see why, in the terms of Western logic, mystical logic seems like crazy wisdom, but it's actually the way things really work at the deepest level.
Yeah, would you say it's true that it's the imagination which allows us to perceive things which are beyond our senses?
It's a faculty. It's actually a faculty. It's not a make believe. At least if something's revealed to us in our inner being as being true via the imagination, it's not just you sit there and concoct anything you feel like. It's
Hmm.
revealed to you by the spirit that a certain imaginative image or idea has some truth to it. But yeah, it's quite an amazing process, and it's a lot of fun, to be honest. The spiritual life is, to be quite honest, fun.
Yes, yes. I often see the contemplative life and the creative life very much the same.
Absolutely. And that's why art is so close to the divine heart and the realm of poetry. I've often thought that poetry should be a world religion,
Yeah,
regardless of the poet's religious or non religious focus. It's innately spiritual.
absolutely. Not just the poet, but the artist of all kinds.
Yeah,
The heart of creativity is listening, just like it is as a contemplative.
absolutely. Yeah.
So we both know that there are limitations to logic, but there's also some side effects or things that can go awry when we completely abdicate the imagination and leave it behind. Um,
Yes, that's really true. And in fact, that's part of what you might call our modern malaise.
I find that fascinating. And as I was reading through some of your notes and writings in preparation for this, there was one paragraph that really stood out to me as powerful. And I'd like to read it back for our listeners and for you and for our conversation. So, there in Expanse of God, Caress of Sophia, you write, the imaginations of many people in our time seem to be asleep. Their daytime corporate jobs suck much of the energy and life out of them. When they return home at night, they switch on the TV and passively take in the shows that are the result of the imaginations of others, that is, of movies and TV producers. Then they go to bed without ever having exercised their own creative capacity. In fact, a claim could be made that one of the reasons why Americans are currently suffering such epidemic levels of low self esteem is because they are doing the things that make them most human, exercising their imaginations, especially in creating a meaningful spiritual myth by which to live. The depression to which many fall prey can, in fact, be viewed as a failure of the imagination to envision new and meaningful ways of looking at everyday life. People just absorb, instead, whatever fantasies the media and entertainment industry or their own religious tradition cook up for them. But it is this loss of imagination that is the source of so much unhappiness in our culture. And then elsewhere, you write, in failing to exercise our imagination, we are abdicating our responsibility to the cosmos. And when I read that, my first response was, whoa, this is relatable in my own experience and just observing the culture too. That for myself, in my own struggles of depression, in those periods, I'm not very much creative. And one of the ways in which I'm able to regain my footing is by exercising my creativity in some way, going out, taking photographs, or picking up a pen, journaling myself, and even trying to write poetry of my own.
Yeah, that's really true. I mean, if you think of it, all of our ancestors created imaginative stories about the stars. They would gaze up at night, and there are these intricate myths that they developed. It was just a part of their daily rhythm, and we have abdicated that God given responsibility to be creators and to be imaginative in the spiritual realm. Maybe we're creative in our work life, but when it comes to spirituality, people just toe the party line or they just give themselves over to the myths created, on TV or internet or in the movies. So, yes, I find it very helpful, say, with depression or grief or anger, as the archetypal psychologists of late 80s and early 90s talked about, James Hillman and Thomas More and others, to see our depression as another force, as though another presence who is begging us to create meaning. So rather than saying, I am depressed, it's more like, oh, well, there's this other that indwells me that's depressed that wants me to make meaning. So it's suddenly empowering to realize that our imagination is needed. I don't know how many times I've gotten out of a funk by not identifying with the afflictive emotion, but realizing that it's asking me, not in words, but just through its very presence, to exercise my imagination to create meaning.
Yeah, there's so much joy to be found by engaging in the creative process.
Oh, so much, yes.
So, speak to us some more about the role and importance of the imagination, particularly the poetic imagination.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see what some thinkers and poets have said about this. So, Henry Corbin, who was a French scholar of Islamic studies, studied Persian philosophy a lot. And he says that in Persian philosophy, there's what's called agent imagination. So, it's an activity that reveals realities to which we otherwise would have no access, he says. So, it's a cognitive power in its own right. It is a faculty, just like reason is, just like will is, just like feeling is. And in fact, he says the agent imagination was viewed as a person or as a presence. So it's not primarily we who are the imaginers, rather, imagination imagines us and our poetic images. So it's a presence. This is something that we've lost in our modern world, this sense that there is a world full of presences who act on us just as we act on them. Ralph Waldo Emerson is another philosopher. He said that imagination is a very high sort of seeing. The feat of the imagination is in showing the convertibility of everything into every other thing. So there is that shape shifting of opposites into each other again. It's the imagination that is able to do that, to see how things that we usually think are different actually become each other. Similarly, Ernesto Cardenal, who was a Nicaraguan priest who actually studied with Thomas Merton for a time, says that the poet tries to see how even the most different things have an underlying likeness. Hence, in the Song of Songs, the biblical book that's just 8 chapters long, it says the mountains skip like rams and the hills like young lambs. Or your hair is like a flock of goats winding down the mountains of Gilead. So in the Song of Songs, you get these interesting kind of images where you would never guess that you could compare a beloved's hair to a flock of goats, walking, or mountains skipping like lambs. But the imagination is able to see how those shapeshift into each other. Another poet, the current poet laureate of the United States, Joy Harjo, who is from the Muskogee tribe, she says that poetry is a bridge over the sea of paradox. In fact, she says people ask, well, are you imagining your poems? And she says, well, probably not. It's actually the poems that are imagining me. So it's this very interesting realization that the imagination is a personal presence. Another poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, he says, this man is occupied by a problem to which he returns like a fly. He wants all opposing things to touch each other just the same. He wishes God, who made them all, would stop right in the midst of them. That person who is infinitely stubborn is the poet. So, yes, this poet combines opposites, and this isn't just a wishful thinking sort of thing. It's actually an intuition of the shape shifting of all things into each other. And the poet has a special receptivity to that kind of logic. It's interesting because some of the thinkers and philosophers have also said that it's the imagination that the natural world uses in order to express itself. For example, the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty once said that our imaginative language is the very voice of the trees, the waves, and the forests. And Henry David Thoreau said that we are the scribe of nature. We're the corn and the grass and the atmosphere writing. Imagination is a very high sort of seeing. It's the marriage of the soul with nature that makes the intellect fruitful and gives birth to the imagination. And indeed, in all of the mystical traditions of the great wisdom traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Sufism, and others, it is our imagination that actually allows the divine to express itself in the world and to know itself through our creative imagination. You might say it's almost as though the divine goes to speak a word into the cosmos, and then we echo back in a new voice and in fresh words that the divine never spoke. Again, this is a mythical, imaginative image that I'm using, so that we add surprise to the whole process. So it's as though our imagination takes something of the divine at our root and adds a fresh sense of surprise to it, which is a big part of what our human creativity is. We're completely dependent on the source of being. I mean, we could go out of existence at any moment, but we contribute something that is fresh and new to the source that is within us.
I find this so interesting. And this idea that we're talking about, that the landscape speaks through us, through our imagination, I think is one of the most central ideas of this discussion, or at least it was one of the most resonant for me as I was going through these few chapters.
Yeah.
This also speaks to the second half of our podcast title, Nature as Self, that there's a personal, expressive aspect to the nature of, well, nature and the divine.
Yes, it's our deepest self that is needed in this cosmos, and our modern world suffers because it doesn't realize that.
So, some, as you say, postmodern scholars might say that humans, when they encounter the natural world, or even in response to what we're talking about here, are just merely projecting their imagination onto a blank slate. But that's not what's going on here, the way you're describing things.
That's correct. That's pretty arrogant of us to think that the projection is only one way. All native cultures have realized that the projection goes two ways. So we project onto the world, and the world projects us. So we come out of nature, we come out of the divine as a projection, so that we will then project, that is, create our own imaginative constructions into the world. So it's a two-way kind of seeing. Psychologist James Hillman says that our imaginative recognition, our childlike act of imagining the world as personal, actually makes it come alive with fresh life. So we realize, as he says, that rather than simply projecting our own fantasies onto the world, we are actually animating it and allowing it to awaken through our innate imaginative capacity. This was a major point when I was in college that Holmes Ralston III, who's sometimes called the grandfather of environmental ethics, made. He said, we forget in our modern age, we think that we just project meaning into the world, but we forget that we are projected by the world into this amazing place. It's quite interesting. The philosopher Hegel said that, and he actually was dependent on philosophers like Meister Eckhart, who we talked about in the previous podcast, said that nature or the divine or God or the one projects us into the world so it can know itself. So then Feuerbach comes along and turns that on its head. He was the father of modern atheism, says, oh no, we project meaning into the world. We project God. Actually, the mystic says, well, opposites shapeshift into each other. Yes, we project our own creative images of God, but we are first projected out of God, who is the sort of a mysterious ground of being. So the projection goes two ways. But again, Western logic wants to separate everything when actually they belong together. We are projected, and we in turn project. We are a word that comes out of the divine, and we echo back in our own creative words that absolutely stun and fascinate the divine.
Another important point here is that paradox is the essence of mysticism. It is imagination which equips us to be able to relate with paradox in a way that logic or other sense faculties can't grasp.
Yeah, that's really true because Aristotelian or Western logic holds opposites apart. It's paradox, the faculty of imagination that can see paradox, that is, the two shape shifting into each other, that's absolutely necessary. So, the imagination then, it has a special role to play in perceiving the world, for only it, through the creation of metaphors and myths, is capable of perceiving paradox. The word metaphor, in fact, means literally to carry across. So meaning is carried across from one thing to another thing. And of course, again, poets are especially skilled at that. So imagination becomes a sort of intellectual glue that is able to show how things that are opposite fit together. So yeah, paradox is that's the stunning ability to see how things move into each other is the essence of mysticism. I mean, I think of meditation experience. For example, you inhabit this kind of spaciousness. You use the out breath. Your mind merges with space, and suddenly, out of that, everything comes to birth. All form, all perceptions, your thoughts, your feelings. It's absolutely fascinating. It's like you're at a movie watching everything come to birth. out of this kind of spacious awareness. It's a paradox. How can it be that everything is really this kind of spacious awareness, and yet everything appears out of it? We don't know why, but it's what happens. And it's that absolutely fascinating paradox that's at the root of life.
So we're going to pivot now and look at some examples of paradox and imagination in action. Now, of course, we are also looking at wilderness Christian mysticism. And at the core of that, it's understanding our relationship with God, the divine. So before we get into those examples, there are traditionally two ways of knowing God. One is the cataphatic way, which uses words and images. And then there's the apophatic way, which goes beyond words and images. And something that you have added is a third element that we're going to get into as well. It's called the poetiphatic, where it
Yes.
combines those approaches.
Yes.
So I just said a bit about each of those three. Would you like to elaborate on those three ways of knowing of God?
So these are three Greek words. Cataphatic means with image. So it is using images in order to try to describe our experience of God. For example, God is good, God is love, a beloved, a rock, light, a night, a person. God speaks. So that's the cataphatic. Another way to talk about that is the via positiva. It's a positive way of speaking of the divine using images. Well, then the apophatic mystical tradition comes along. Apophatic is a Greek word meaning without image. And it says, no, wait a minute. God is beyond all of these images. So this is also called the via negativa. This is where you say, well, actually, the divine transcends all of that. So Pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite, 6th century Syrian Christian mystic, says that God solidly transcends mind and being, completely unknown and non existent. He exists beyond being, and he's known beyond the mind. He surpasses everything and also transcends the source of divinity, transcends the source of goodness. And so he says that when you go outside of yourself in absolute ecstasy, you raise yourself to the ray of divine darkness that's beyond being, leaving all behind and released from all. So this is the way of negation to say that the divine is beyond all of these things. Now, what I discovered is in the mystical tradition, sometimes there's an overemphasis on the apophatic to where the creation itself isn't adequately honored. And we need to be able to find images in nature. First of all, we are tasked with preserving this beautiful planet, but we also need to find the source of our spirituality in this amazing planet. And I find that an overemphasis on the apophatic transcendence among the traditional contemplatives often leads to denial of the importance of this beautiful earth. It's just a momentary place. We're actually going to go to a place beyond it all when we die. But I think that in our era of massive ecological devastation, the mystical tradition can't any longer afford to focus only on transcendence and a movement beyond the earth. So that's why I developed the poetiphatic. Matthew Fox would call it the via creativa. We might also call it the via poetica. And so, for example, Dionysius talks about this a bit when he uses the term superabundant. He says, in the good, non being is really an excess of being, not a life, but superabundant life. It's not a mind, but superabundant wisdom. It is inexpressible good, one source of all unity, this supra existent being, mind beyond mind, and word beyond speech. And so it's poetic images that enables us to get at this third way of knowing the divine. It is a paradoxical image that then leads into wordless wonder. And so it really is a deeper kind of apophatic spirituality, I believe, using an image as a springboard to go beyond the image, not simply negating the image.
So from here on, we're going to take this model and go through some examples of metaphors and images.
Yeah, so we might start, for example, with this sort of idea that God is a being, right? That this being that has boundaries, and of course, a lot of young people critique this, and rightly so, because it has its limitations. So the apophatic comes along and says, "Well, God is beyond being." And in fact, God does not exist because that comes from a Latin word, ex ist, which means to stand out from. And God is the underlying reality, doesn't stand out from anything. The poetiphatic then says, well, actually, God is being itself. But actually, better, it says, God is the ground of being prior to being, or as in the playful image of Rumi, God is the am I not? In other words, God's reality is assumed, and that can seem like a nothing or a no thing to us. And the only way that we know this reality of being itself, the assumed reality, is when we playfully seem pushed away from it. For example, Henry David Thoreau says, it's not when I'm going to meet God, but when I'm just turning away and leaving God alone that I discover that God is. In other words, you're pushed away from this ground that is not perceivable because it's in your very act of perception. It's not itself perceptible. The only way that you can know it is when you seem to be pushed away into doubt, into unknowing. We experience this kind of leaving when we're pushed away from our union with God into our own being in the world. We would never know divine union with this ground that's beyond being, this assumed reality, unless we felt pushed away from it. And so the act of seeming to be pushed away is the very act in which we perceive it. It's kind of like the act of reading. If you're trying to read a book and you have it right next to your nose, you can't see anything. So you have to push it away in order to read the words. Similarly, we have to be pushed away in order to realize, oh, there is this underlying kind of reality that goes beyond words that I'm a part of. So, a second sort of triad would be in the God is love, which starts with the cataphatic, which is God loves us. You hear this all the time. God is this being who loves us. And so the apophatic comes along and says, no, wait a minute. God's beyond the act of loving. God's actually can't be envisioned as loving because love is generally conceived as just one specific activity among many in which a person might engage. So, for example, there could be a person loving, but they could also hate, or they could also be indifferent. So, to say that God is loving is inadequate. We're trying to get at something deeper. So, the poetiphatic comes along and says, well, actually, God is love. Or more accurately, God is kind of an assumed reality. And it's this assumed reality that's love. But if we were to put it into words, we could say that instead of saying to us, I love you, God's presence says something like, how wouldn't I love you? But this statement doesn't occur in words because each of us is a word of God's love at the root of our being. And yet, because that word is so close to us, that love, we don't know how to perceive it. So we have to be pushed away from it, seemingly, into the difficult experiences of life. And we're playfully pushed away. It's as though the divine is saying to us, well, show me, how wouldn't I love you in this situation? And how wouldn't I love you in that situation? But of course, at first, we interpret that seeming wouldn't to mean we're not loved. That's all we seem to hear if we talk about this mythically. We just hear a wouldn't, but we don't realize that actually it's a way of affirming us. How wouldn't I love you? And then we're supposed to say, oh, I see, you're at the root of my being. I'm immersed in this kind of love. It's kind of like a story that Thomas Keating used to tell. The baby fish says to the mom, "What is this water that I hear about that is all around us?" And the mother says in the story, "You silly little fish, just try flopping yourself out on land, and you'll see what the water is." So the little fish does and says, "Oh, I see. The water's all around and in me." but the fish wouldn't have known that unless it was out of the water for a minute. So it's similar to us. The experience of non-union or seeming to be pushed away is the only way we experience in a flash this reality in which we are continually immersed. So it's very playful, the poetiphatic means of knowing the divine.
Well, we're going to take turns from here on out going through these examples. So it's my turn next.
Yeah, that's right, Will. Go for it.
So, beginning with the cataphatic, someone might say, God is a person. And from an apophatic perspective, we would say that God is transpersonal, beyond being a person. This notion of a person generally includes the idea of discrete boundaries, but God is the all and thus independent of boundaries. Now, the poetiphatic would approach it as such. God is a personal present, not a person. God is a supra person or hyper person. That is, God is emptied out canonically into us, becoming one with our experience. Because God is so personal, God is able to know our experience from the inside. And here, God is known as person only in the second person as thou. For example, in wilderness contemplative prayer, there is a sense of being held or being magnetized without there being any one to do the holding or magnetizing. For he is emptied out into our perception, being held and being magnetized.
That leads to the next example. We might say, oh, God's presence grasps us lovingly from deep within the abyss of our being. Teresa of Avila talks about this absorption, this being absorbed, this sense of our awareness being grasped. But the apophatic comes along and says, well, wait a minute, God's beyond being someone who would do this kind of grasping, because you could grasp and not grasp. You can love and not love, and God is beyond that. So the poetiphatic comes along and says, okay, we are a being grasped, but there's no one grasping us because of the divine self-emptying. That's kenosis, divine self-emptying into our experience of being grasped. So there's instead just a sense of being grasped, being held. And if we put this being grasped in terms of God's loving gaze, so that that sense of absorption or being held is being grasped in the gaze of love that arises from the depths of our being, we can say that we're grasped and held in this gaze. But no matter how far we descend into our inner abyss, we can't ever arrive at the source of the gaze. So, because of God's self emptying, the poetiphatic says, God's gaze only occurs through our perception of being gazed upon by a source that is endlessly deep within us. So, our perception of God's gaze only occurs in the second person through our awareness of being gazed upon. So, that's a sense that we're held. We're held in this gaze, we're held in this magnetism without there being any magnet. Why? Because it's emptied out into that being gazed upon. So, Raymond Panikar says it's not like there is a self and then there is God. He says instead there is what he calls a thou I. That is, that sense that we are held, we are grasped, and without even being able to say that there is an I, because it is emptied out into our experience of being held and being grasped. So there's this playfulness in mysticism that can't be gotten at any other way than through this sort of mythical sort of image, poetiphatic image.
I'm thinking, I just wanted to add this to the conversation, is that these images and metaphors are really meant to be met with a meditative approach, or even in the spirit of Lectio Divina, to let the metaphor image steepen us like tea in water.
That's correct. Yes.
Because we're not adding too much commentary onto after these examples, because they're really just meant to be absorbed, to settle into the mind. Otherwise, we just keep using logic to try to explain, well, here's what we mean by this.
Right.
At some point, it just has to
Work
be,
on you.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this isn't some sort of cute intellectual exercise. It's just like if you ask a poet, "Oh, what is the meaning of your poem?"
Mm.
The poet says, "Well, it's in the poetry itself. I can't explain it." So it's the same thing with these images. These images are meant to work on us. And if you and as a listener, find that a particular one of these metaphors doesn't work, just let it go, and then take the ones that do work on you. And what happens is you steep in them, as Will says, and then what happens is they're meant to lead you to wordless wonder, so
Mm.
that you go beyond the image. It becomes a springboard into a kind of wonder. So, yes, it's not just a cute kind of intellectual exercise that you then try to reason with. You let whatever of these metaphors touch you as it will. And if it doesn't touch you, then you go on to another one, and you may find the divine reveals to you a completely different kind of poetic
Mm.
image.
Well, good stuff. Let's get into the next one. From a cataphatic perspective, one might say God thinks us into existence, or we are God's idea. And from a apophatic perspective, it would be said that God is beyond thinking, for we generally perceive of thinking merely as one activity among many. And now, from a poetophatic perspective, God is, quote, thinking without a thinker, unquote. For the thinker is blissfully self emptied into the thought. So we are grasped in the experience of being thought, yet without there being a thinker with a capital T, because God is canonically self emptied into the thought of us. We experience this being grasped as a thought of God during wilderness contemplative prayer.
Yeah, there's an interesting book by Stephen Batchelor, who's a Buddhist, called Thoughts Without a Thinker. Of course, in the Buddhist tradition, there's just thoughts, there's no thinker. Christian mysticism adds to that this playful image. Oh, the reason for that isn't that there's no thinker, but it's that the thinker, that in this case God, is completely absorbed in and emptied into the thought of us. So there's only the thought of us, there's no thinker anymore. Richard Rohr talks about that. God is completely lost in the thought of us. So you don't have a thinker. You don't have that original thinker, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's completely emptied out into the thought, as sort of like when you're lost in reverie. You forget you exist. You're just lost in thinking about your beloved. So similar here, because of the self emptying of the divine through bliss and pure delight, that we have this thoughts without a thinker. So we might also say, you hear this all the time in the cataphatic, God speaks everything into existence, right? That God is a word, or that everything is itself a word of God, the one who's present at the root of the being of everything. But the apophatic then comes along and says, wait a minute, God is beyond speaking. God doesn't have a mouth. God doesn't have words that come out, for a word is a particular thing, and God is beyond particulars. But then the poetophatic comes along and says, ah, but wait a minute, it's actually more playful than this. Maybe it's actually like this: God never had a chance to speak a word of love because of blissful self emptying, or what we call kenosis. God has eternally been emptied out in love before the word could ever be spoken. But nevertheless, surprise, echoes of God's never spoken word appear in each and everything. Mysteriously, there's no original word, no speaking, and yet echoes indeed appear. And as I look out my window here in New Mexico, about an hour away by car, but only probably 20 minutes as the crow flies, I could see Echo Amphitheater, where this insight originally came to me. It is this beautiful cliff, sandstone Jurassic cliff of beige and yellow and orange sandstone. And if you get right up next to it, there is a row of pinon junipers behind you, and then behind that's the highway. So if you get right next to it, you can't hear cars on the highway, but you can, because of the concave surface of the amphitheater, hear echoes of the cars. I've camped there at night, and same thing with coyote calls. You hear echoes of the coyote calls, but you don't hear any coyote calls themselves. So, of course, in this example, there really are cars, there really are coyotes, but in the spiritual realm, there aren't any coyotes, there aren't any cars, because the divine is completely emptied out in bliss. And what you get is echoes. So you get echoes, and for me, this is one of the main practices that I use in wilderness insight meditation, that everything is an echo. Every perception, every thought, every feeling is an echo without there being any original. Absolute amazement. Again, not some sort of intellectual argument or idea. It is this image that springs you into wordless wonder at the wonder of all things.
The next metaphor we're going to look at has to do with mirror images. Someone from a cataphatic mindset might say, God appears in the mirror of each visible thing. Every being is a mirror image of God. And then someone speaking from an apophatic perspective would say, God is actually beyond appearances, and so is beyond whatever is mirrored. And then we have the poetophatic bringing the two together. There is an image of God appearing in the mirror of each visible thing. But because of God's blissful kenosis, or self emptying, no one is there standing before the mirror. There are mirror images, but also no original.
I love this one. It reminds me of Ibn al Arabi, a Sufi mystic, who brought up this image. He said, you're standing and looking in the mirror, and when you look at your eye in the mirror, in the pupil, you see someone else inside of your pupil. So you go, ah, someone is here with me. So you turn around to see who it is that's appearing in the pupil of your reflected eye, and guess what? There's no one. So there's, again, this kind of playful image. According to the laws of physics, there has to be, right? There has to be someone that is the source of um, that image that's in your pupil, that person that's appearing inside of your pupil. So we make use of the law of ordinary logic in order to go beyond it. Yeah, there should be someone, but what? There isn't anyone. So anyway, that's kind of this playfulness of the poetophatic realm. So, if we go to another image, we would say God is light. You hear this all the time. Oh, I experienced the light of the divine. Well, that's a beautiful image. All things light up in the divine. And, we talk about enlightenment, right? The apophatic comes along and says, well, whatever light God might be is actually emptied out. So that you can't say God is light, God is the dazzling darkness, as some of the mystics have talked about. So there's an endarkenment. And indeed, in our time, there is a realization of the importance of seeing the night sky as a resource and what has been lost in only talking about light. We've forgotten that there's a whole world in the darkness. Uh, we come out of darkness from our mother's womb. There's a whole mycelial world of fungi that connects everything in the darkness. So it's important for the apophatic to come along and say, wait a minute, it's a darkness. But the poetophatic says, there's a way to put these two together. And here I think of the experience of alpenglow, which is, we see in our mountains here all the time. The mountains that I'm looking right out on now are called the Sangre de Cristo. They are the blood of Christ mountains. And the Spanish explorers who first came through here in the 16th century marveled at the alpenglow, the ruddy, the red, and the purple, and the pink of the mountains that occurs at sunset. And of course, during alpenglow, because the mountains are higher than you, you're in darkness while the light is shining on the mountains and you see this pink. So there's a sense that the mountains are lighting up, but you can't see any sun because the sun is below the horizon. But in the poetophatic realm, you could travel, say that we are the mountains, all of creation are the mountains that suddenly light up with divine life. But when we try to look over to the horizon to see the divine light, God, who's the source of that lighting up, we could travel endlessly along the horizon of being and never come to any original light. Why? Who knows? It's a mysterious, but in one sense, the divine is completely emptied out into our perception of everything lighting up in this kind of alpenglow. So again, it is a poetic image that explodes itself and allows you to be lost in wordless wonder.
The alpenglow is one of my favorite images in real life as well as here.
Yeah, and as photographers, we love it, don't
Yeah,
we?
yeah,
We look for that moment. Sometimes it's just maybe a minute to try to capture that with our cameras. I know you've taken some great images of alpenglow on Rainier. I think from Tipsoo Lake, maybe in the park there.
yeah. I'm certainly imagining places along the Cascade Range as we were sitting with that example. So we're going to move now from the mountains to the canyons. The next one, God is an abyss of being out of which all creatures emerge. That's a cataphatic phrase. Now, from an apophatic perspective, God is beyond being an abyss. For an abyss is circumscribed, and God is beyond everything. And bringing it together with the poetophatic, God is at the core of a bottomless abyss, which opens up beneath all of the perceptible abysses of the world. God's gaze issues from the bottomless abyss and magnetizes us. But no matter how far we travel into that abyss, we can never arrive at the source of the gaze. All beings arise from the magnetic source present in the depths of this abyss, even though it's bottomless. And we can never arrive at that source, no matter how deep within we travel.
Yeah, and this, of course, is the experience of contemplative prayer, where, as the mystics have all talked about the abyss, and we talked in the first podcast, I think, about abyss, calls to abyss in the Psalms. There's this sense that there's this presence, this magnetic force that magnetizes us from deep within the abyss. But no matter how deep we go, we could never come to that source because it's emptied out into our perception of being magnetized in the abyss. So, this is the experience of contemplative prayer, grasped and held, but no one doing the holding. And we're descending into the abyss of our being and sensing that we're magnetized, but without there being any magnet.
Another thing that stood out to me here, saying that no matter how far we travel into that abyss, we can never arrive at the source because it's infinite. And this is something
Yeah,
you've
it's
said
infinite.
elsewhere, even in your classes, that the spiritual path is one of affinity. So you can never
Yeah.
really know who's farther ahead or where they're at because there's no end.
Yeah, that's right.
That has always remained for me.
Yeah, maybe a beginner has traveled half a millimeter along the path of that abyss, coming toward the surface. But an adept, a spiritual adept, has traveled maybe 2 millimeters, and neither of that means anything in relation to infinity. So it breeds a sense of humility.
Yes.
Well, so then the other image, so that's in contemplative prayer, where we experience the self as an abyss and God as this infinite, magnet within that abyss. In the experience of insight meditation, wilderness insight meditation, Christian insight meditation, we experience our true self as being lost in spaciousness. There's a sense of an expanse. Of course, Buddhism specializes in this spaciousness, and I've uncovered quite a few statements among the Christian mystics that speaks about the divine being this expanse. So the cataphatic would say that, well, God is this spaciousness or this expanse. But the apophatic comes along and says, wait a minute, God is beyond spaciousness because God can't be anything, not even spaciousness. Even spaciousness is a limited idea. And the poetophatic then comes and says, okay, you guys, let's look here. God is a boundless, imperceptible spaciousness, or what Eckhart calls expanseless expanse, and God is lost in that spaciousness, lost in spacious bliss. So we discover God by going to the place where God dwells, that is the perceivable spaciousness, where God, the imperceptible spaciousness, is lost. So this is something that Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite had said in the 6th century in Syria, he said, even though we can't experience the essence of God because it goes beyond all things, there's the apophatic, we can experience the place where the divine dwells. And that, in this case, is in the spaciousness, or you might say in the night sky, in the darkness. And that's the place where both God and we are lost together in the place of the divine. It's similar to the Ark of the Covenant that the Israelites carried through the desert. If you were to take that ark apart and look at the Holy of Holies inside of it, guess what? There's nothing there. So it's a place where the divine dwells, but it's as a no thing. So you have expanseless expanse. You have the divine lost in spaciousness, and we lost there too. You might also say that that's sort of the image that you hear, that we all climb the mountain, that every religious tradition climbs the mountain and then we meet at the top, right? Different paths up to the top of the mountain: Christianity, Buddhism, Sufism. But the mystic says, well, actually, all of the traditions get lost. All the paths get lost in the cloud at the top of the mountain. So there's a sense of being lost, and the divine presence as lost blissfully, as the Hindus would say, ananda, that blissfulness. St. Thomas Aquinas calls it the sigh of God, that sense of being lost in bliss in this spacious expanse.
So the next one, God is a circle encompassing all things. And from an apophatic perspective, God cannot be conceived of as a circle, for a circle can only have one center. That understanding would unfortunately leave the door open for a fundamentalist to come along and inform us that, in a Christian context, such a center consists only in a literal understanding of Jesus, which includes the idea that his identity, his self, has clear boundaries, which separate him from every other self in the universe. In other words, such a view leads to exclusivity, an approach that has, of course, caused much of the world's pain and suffering. But the danger is that a person or group can say that they are the only ones who can identify with the center. Yet a poetophatic perspective comes along and tries to unite it all. So, in this sense, God is a circle whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. It's this kind of image that invites us to see that every being, every self, is in actuality a different center of that same infinite circle, which is God. Or, in other words, each perspective is, in some sense, central to the experience of God's vast reality, for each is a different view of God's infinity. And to this, I would add, it reminds me of the spectrum from exclusivity, inclusivity, and pluralism. And from a pluralistic perspective, we could say that no one person, no one tradition has a complete monopoly on truth. Everyone adds something to that conversation.
That's really true, Will. And I love this image. It was a prime medieval image. Alan of Lille and some other medieval mystics, a whole host of them, loved this image of God being a circle whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. Beautiful image. Well, I think our final metaphor or poetophatic image is that of the Trinity. And so we might say, from a cataphatic perspective, that God is this Trinity, this three persons in one. But then the apophatic comes along and says, no, wait a minute, God is an absolute one. And it goes beyond the three persons. And a Unitarian might say this as well, or a Muslim might say this as well. So, for example, Meister Eckhart might say that this is the Godhead that transcends God. It's the one. And then these sort of three, and we'll talk about the Trinity on an experiential level in future podcasts. So we might, as a poetophatic mystic, use this image in this way. As we gaze toward the horizon, We might say that's the realm of the sacred masculine. We see a mirror, and in that mirror, we find an attractive feminine presence walking from the immanent world all around us, the earth, traveling toward the horizon. However, when we turn around away from the horizon mirror and we look for her in the earthly immanent realm, we find no one. And similarly, if we gaze at the earthly realm present all around us, the realm of the sacred feminine, we find a second mirror, one that faces toward the horizon. And in that mirror, we find an attractive masculine presence walking from the horizon, traveling toward the earth. However, when we turn around and away from the earthly mirror, guess what? We look for him on the horizon and we can't find anybody. So this is quite amazing, the poetic mystic says. There are mirror image of both masculine and feminine presences, yet no originals, because both are emptied out in bliss and love into one another, into the union of the two in the in-between spot. That's the Holy Spirit in the classic Trinity, where we dwell as human beings. So we might, if you use traditional language, have a transcendent Father on one side, an immanent Mother on the other, Holy Spirit in the union in the middle, but you can't find any originals. So, do the persons of the Trinity exist? Yes, they're in the mirror, but they also not exist because you can't find any originals. So here again in mysticism, existence and non-existence come together. There's mirror images, but there's no originals. So they're both. Do they exist? Yes. Do they not exist? Yes. So both are true at the same time. If you want to put this in maybe more Buddhist terms, you might say that the masculine presence is emptiness or spaciousness that's filled with a sense of personality. And the feminine presence would then be form and energy filled with its own sense of personality. And then we're in the middle, that third quote person, and we're in between. So you have a sense where you look into the mirror of spaciousness and suddenly form appears. But when you look around, you can't see any original form. And when you look in the mirror in the realm of form, you see spaciousness. But when you turn around, you can't see any presence of spaciousness. In meditation experience, there is this sense that we are spacious awareness. Form appears, but it's sort of shimmering. You can't find any substantial sense that it exists. And similarly, if you start with form and you look straight through it into transparency, but again, it's sort of a shimmery no thingness. So again, playful image that explodes itself and leads into wordless wonder, as all of these examples have done.
Wordless wonder. I love that phrase. And this has been a fun episode going through all these images and exploring the poetic imagination.
Yeah, again, so for the listener, take whatever of these images are meaningful to you and just sort of meditate on them and put them in your own words. Maybe record them in your journal and ponder them, and then let them lead you to wordless wonder, because that is the point of all good spirituality and of all good science, really, is to lead to a sense of awe and wonder at the absolute amazing nature of this cosmos. Indeed, that's what quantum physics does, right? You look at all this seemingly solid form and you realize that science tells us it's 99% empty space. How amazing. Well, good spirituality does something similar. It shows us how amazing this world is, which then leads us to want to take care of it and to preserve it.
Well, religion and spirituality at its core is about meaning making, wholeness
Yes,
making. And the traditions give us a reservoir of metaphors, language, and examples to turn to. But I think it's important to remember that it's an active, ongoing process that is evolving as we do. So we are actually called to participate in that process of meaning making, like we're talking about here with our own metaphors, our own myths.
yes.
So these are just examples. many of which you've come up with. So we encourage you, our listeners, to find your own, or what's coming up within yourself to make meaning of your own experience.
Because again, it's your creativity and your imagination that's important. It's as though you're an echo of the divine, totally rooted in the divine, and yet you add words and a fresh voice to that echo that utterly surprises the divine. So it's up to you and to each of us to be creative in our own unique way, in a way that no one else is.
Well, I think we've come to the end for today. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Will. This has been a lot of fun.
Likewise. I look forward to the next one.
Yes, me too.
Dear friends and listeners, we've come to the end of this episode of Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking, commenting, and sharing this episode with others. If you have a question you would like answered, are interested in learning more about a topic, or would like to pursue one-on-one spiritual direction with either of us, you can write to us at natureasbeloved@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at natureasbeloved. For daily photos and quotes, you can follow Stephen on Facebook or Instagram at the Stephen Hatch Outlook. And for more information about Stephen's books, you can find them on Stephen K. Hatch's Amazon author page. Until next time, may you continue to walk in beauty, be well, and stay wild.